The terms Marxism, Communism, and Socialism are closely related. Often used interchangeably, they are nouns, meaning that they can substitute one for the other grammatically. But these definitions are an absolute mess in practical terms. Based on how they are used today, we can just call them synonyms, with one exception. The term socialism has a somewhat acceptable definition as democratic socialism, or some variant of socialism ideas mixed in practical ideas. We'll get to acceptable usage later on in the video. The 19th century philosopher Karl Marx and his collaborator Friedrich Engels developed a set of beliefs that later coalesced into an ideology called Marxism. They wrote many books, probably the most famous is the 1848 Communist Manifesto, a short manifesto written for the Communist League. Their works have inspired major revolutions and many liberation movements all over the world. Marx and Engels developed the idea of labor theory of value, which essentially points out that under capitalism, wages would always be lower than the value of the labor. The bourgeois would accumulate profits to expand production. As production expanded, the proletariat would get poorer and the bourgeois would get richer. Proletariat are factory workers who would become extensions of the machines. They would remain poor until they rose up and seized power with their numbers. They also predicted the inevitable collapse of capitalism. The stages toward the transition included a dictatorship of the proletariat, where in the first transitional step, proletariat-led governments would take over. There would be a transitional period, followed by socialism, and eventually leading to communism, where all classes would disappear. Communism has no government, just local democratic committees, no money, and no capital. Marx and Engels talked about this idea of the means of production. The means of production described the process and material existence of everything that went on in the factory to make goods. But then they go on to use the term as the object in their argument. In a communist society, the means of production will be used for all. Okay, but they fail to explain how. Let's look at it. Under capitalism, the bourgeois control the means of production, whereby they exploit labor as just another input, which they pay very little for. The goal of communism is that the means of production will be used for everyone's benefit. Somehow a transition will happen during the transitional phases towards communism. The means of production imply the following: deciding what factory to build, building the factory, buying the machines, assigning the jobs, training the workers, acquiring inputs from suppliers, managing production, deciding what to make, control warehouses, move the goods to the customers. Of course, the production process is integrated with hundreds of other factories where the output of one is the input of another. This will now be controlled by the proletariat during the transition, evolving further eventually into a classless society. In that classless society, there's no money, there's no capital, there's no incentive. Everybody gets everything that they need based on their needs. Somebody has to be an engineer, somebody an accountant, and most people have to be working on the machines. It simply has not been thought through. Marx left things unanswered because he had no answer. What people must be aware of is the dangers of glorifying a person and a theory just because it became very popular. It must be evaluated and considered on its own merits. They both wrote separate works over several decades, and their ideas evolved and changed over time. All of their works are debated by scholars today and collectively form a body of work called Marxism. Even the terms socialism and communism are confused. These terms are confusing even by men like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Marx and Engels often use socialism to describe democratic socialist movements, sometimes referring to them pejoratively as bourgeois socialism. Other times it was interchangeable with communism. The simple explanation usually given is that Marx's philosophy describes a transition from capitalism to a transition period known as the dictatorship of the proletariat, followed by socialism, and then to communism. Marxism is simply the collection of ideas that describe the process of transformation from capitalism to communism. What is true to say is that while their theories seem coalesced and fixed, their ideas in their own lifetimes evolved, and would have evolved further had they lived longer. They mix philosophy and economics with practical politics, as we'll see in the manifesto. As much as they would have wanted to be remembered as philosophers and scientists, they both were political people, and their words do reflect that. Unlike great scientists of the day that meticulously followed the scientific method, Marxist theories are rife with assertions that bear no specific validation and have undergone no testing. One must take with a grain of salt their scientific claims. Their claims of the inevitable behavior of capitalism have been proven wrong. They have categorized people as proletariat and bourgeois. But what does that mean? Individual people change, people evolve, people move between classes. What about all the people in between? What about all the people with complicated family ties and in between jobs and mixed marriages? What about the salaried professionals? What about the person who works for a low wage to put himself through school and eventually gets a professional job and starts a business? The simple creation of classes into two binaries makes no sense today. A scientist whose theories were so wrong would be irrelevant today, but Marxism is a framework by which many movements frame their new ideas. His followers don't claim he was right about everything. They just feel he was had sufficient insights and relevant enough to base contemporary ideas on. During Marx's lifetime, no country had yet a communist revolution. The only major manifestation was the Paris Commune of 1871, which lasted only about 2 months. And it turned out to be a disaster. Many people were slaughtered. It was brutally put down. He never had a chance to see his ideas engaged seriously with geopolitics. So it is only anyone's guess as to what he would have thought about the various versions of communism and their dictatorships that followed in the 20th century. The world Marx described in his writings and his philosophy never panned out, not even close. His legacy lives on, though, in the ideas of others that he has inspired. Would he have imagined the group of proletariat elites that would lead countries, hold high administrative offices, and murder millions? Over the last century and a half, there have been many variations of socialist experiments. In the countries where it has taken power, its flavor depends on politics and circumstances and the geopolitics of the time. In Stalin's Soviet Union, it was called Marxist-Leninism, an ideological justification for a dictatorship dominated by one party. It was more like an excuse to kill its opponents and retain power. In fact, just about every country that ever had a political movement that called itself Marxist or communist and actually had or shared some power had its own version. Lenin described the USSR as a socialist republic, as a manifestation of the first stage to communism, where a single nation would interact with the bourgeois world, still run by capitalism, still tolerating some forms of bourgeois behavior. This was the dictatorship of the proletariat. Many Marxist-Leninists use the term socialist as the second stage of Marxism, or what Marx referred to sometimes as lower communism. Many governments have called themselves Marxist, but only had the inclination to move cautiously with mixed socialist and free market policies. The reason why so many political movements have called themselves Marxist without resembling Marxism is that these movements have solidarity with many principles of Marxism without being real Marxists. Many movements broke away from communism and adopted the ideology known as democratic socialism. Democratic socialism holds to the belief in real democracy and liberal freedoms, like the freedom to speak and write freely. They believe that capitalism can coexist with socialist principles by achieving legislation that protects workers' rights, mandates standards for employment, and offers social programs for very vulnerable people. Third world socialism differs from Marxist communism in several striking ways. Third world socialism embraces nationalism, whereas in traditional Marxist communism, nationalism was anathema. Third world socialism tends to be anti-globalist, whereas Marxism did see a global worldwide revolution that would end nations and nation-states. And thirdly, third world socialism tends to embrace the local bourgeoisie, whereas Marxism tends to theorize that the bourgeoisie would need to be eliminated early on in the transition to communism. Prior to the fall of the Soviet Union and the capitalist reforms in China, Third World Socialism was a viable ideology for Third World governments, as they would leverage the geopolitical forces of the Cold War. Most communist countries had a superpower benefactor, either the USSR or China. Since the 1990s, however, Third World Socialism has moved to the back burner. It was revived in 1998 in the Venezuela when Hugo Chavez came to power and launched his Bolivarian revolution. That revolution has since collapsed. Many of the ideas of Third World Socialism, though, still linger on in Latin America to this day. Ordinary people are not wired to believe in Marxism nor its communist paradise. Humans have ambition and have a natural competitive spirit. This type of anti-competitive Marxism is not really what the people of the Third World want, who are looking for a more social justice-based Third World revolution, nor is it any significant group in the Third World citizens would aspire to this form of socialism. I also want to point out something that I noticed while doing some research for this video. I searched the communist and socialist space in America and did a quick read of various socialist parties. And one thing struck me: how preoccupied these developed countries' socialist parties are with minorities, immigrants, and other progressive politics, and third world poverty. It's hard to make the argument for socialism when your slogan is something like, most workers are fine, but workers of the world still unite so minorities and people in the third world can get justice. But in the third world, there's a new factor that is relevant: a nationalist rebellion against globalism. This rebellious instinct is not really interested in philosophical theories. They'd be proud to acquire some of the acumen that developed countries have. So the mix of mass poverty and national envy of developed countries is a fuel that revolutionaries in the third world can exploit. What is socialism? Under Marxism, it was a society on the transition to communism. There are countries with systems that are constitutionally socialist that call themselves Marxist, but with a lighter variation that are open to interactions with the non-Marxist countries, and businesses even tolerating some market capitalism internally. This includes countries like Cuba and Venezuela. There are social democratic countries that are essentially free market, with varying degrees of socialist legislation. These countries tend to have higher taxes, more social services, free healthcare, free or subsidized post-secondary education. There are non-socialist countries with some pieces of socialist legislation. So that brings us back to these terms: communism, socialism, and Marxism. Socialism is generic. It can mean anything you want it to mean, from a construct in Marxist philosophy where it was just one step before communism, to a democratic country trying social programs for ordinary people. Marxism has also become pretty generic as well, as it is used by regimes aspiring to significantly move quite far left, but still happy sharing space with non-Marxist world and some free market forces. But this term still denotes being quite far left. You can be an intellectual Marxist. It says that you are clearly somewhat on the left side of the spectrum. You can be both a Marxist and believe in democracy and accept centrist parties winning and running the country as a capitalist state. Communism, this is always quite far left. By using the term communism, you are making a clear statement that you are very serious about your left-wing economic agenda. But just using the term does not imply an adherence to Marxist philosophy. Communism, in today's vernacular, really describes a direction in thinking rather than a goal. So anyways, I think that's a wrap. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.